welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, the US President Donald Trump announces that he is pausing military aid to Ukraine. This follows on from last week's Oval Office clash with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Ukraine says it will have to work through all available channels to maintain its ties with Washington, but it will do everything possible to hold out on the front line. And President Trump's long-threatened tariffs against Canada and Mexico come into effect, and existing China tariffs are doubled, leaving the nations affected mulling their retaliation. Hello and welcome to the program. It has been 4 days since that very public clash between the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the US President Donald Trump in the Oval Office. And now the US is saying that it is suspending all military aid to Ukraine, ramping up pressure on Kyiv to negotiate with Russia. Well, President Trump, who says he wants a quick end to the war, has criticized President Zelenskyy for not being, quote, more appreciative of US support. And he warned that he, quote, won't be around for long without a ceasefire deal with Moscow. Well, the suspension halts deliveries of ammunition, vehicles, and other equipment, including putting a halt on agreements made under the Biden administration.
Well, I just think he should be more appreciative because this country has stuck with them through thick and thin. We've given them much more than Europe, and Europe should have given more than us because, as you know, that's right there, that's the border. I want to see it end fast. I don't want to see this go on for years and years. Now, President Zelenskyy supposedly made a statement today in AP. I'm not a big fan of AP, so maybe it was an incorrect statement, but he said he thinks the war's going to go on for a long time. And he better not be right about that. Now, maybe somebody doesn't want to make a deal, and if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long.
President Trump speaking there. Meanwhile, in an interview with Fox News, the US Vice President J.D. Vance opened up about the heated Oval Office meeting. Here's what he had to say.
Let's go back to the Oval Office Friday.
Yep.
From your perspective.
Yeah, great TV. As the president said. What I noticed is that for the first 25, 30 or so minutes, he tried to sort of bend over backwards to be gracious and kind to Zelenskyy, even when Zelenskyy was kind of needling him. And then when it really went off the rails, of course, is when I asked, or you had a Polish journalist who asked a question, the president answered it, and then I answered it. And then something about my answer just really set Zelenskyy off. And I do think that there was just a certain sense of, there was a lack of respect, there was a certain sense of entitlement. I really don't care what President Zelenskyy says about me or anybody else, but he showed a clear unwillingness to engage in the peace process. That's the real breakdown, is I think Zelenskyy wasn't yet there, and I think frankly now still isn't there.
That was the Vice President J.D. Vance speaking there. Well, the US President Donald Trump has reiterated that the Ukrainian people are the ones most affected by the war, insisting that it should end soon. Well, many Ukrainians woke up to the news that President Trump had paused military aid in their fight against Russia, and that now they're grappling with the consequences of this decision. Let's hear their reaction.
I believe that if the US cared about the population, about the people of Ukraine, about the civilian population, about the people who live in this city, they would not stop providing aid in the form of anti-aircraft missiles, EW defense systems, and so on.
I
have hope that Trump could be forgiving. I hope that pausing the aid is a temporary measure, that everything will be fine. I hope that we can do things on our own without Trump. It's not true that we can do nothing, as he said, that we can only hold out for 2 weeks. That's not true, no. But we do really need this help. I hope he finally understands whose side he should be on.
Okay, reaction there on the streets of Kyiv. Well, let's get some more analysis now from Captain Brent Sadler, former US military diplomat, now a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation Center for National Defense, who joins us from DC. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Captain Sadler. Great to have you with us. President Trump, we've heard, has ordered a halt to all military aid to Ukraine. Just want to get your thoughts. Why has he done this? And is this the right thing to have done?
Well, I think, quite frankly, a pause sends a signal. It's not clear if this is going to be a permanent or a ceasing of military or financial assistance to Ukraine. But the pause definitely underscores the significance and the seriousness that President Trump is approaching the ending of hostilities through a negotiated solution, a peace, and hopefully a lasting peace.
Yes, well, obviously it takes two sides to reach that point. I mean, are you of the view that the Russian President Vladimir Putin is also serious about negotiating a fair and realistic peace with Ukraine?
Well, I think that's yet to be seen. I mean, all that's been occurring the last few weeks with the new administration here in D.C. under President Trump, led by General Kellogg, is really a sensing and trying to set the contours and the conditions to which both sides could come to the table for negotiation. Of course, it does take both Ukraine and Russia to want that negotiated solution for it to actually go forward, if it's not to be a delay tactic for rearming and recommencing hostilities. But I think the reality that we have to acknowledge here is that both the Ukrainians and the Russians independently feel that they still have a lot of fight left. So unfortunately, getting to a peace negotiation sooner is probably not going to happen until after there's another series of offensives by both sides.
Yeah, and a rushed conclusion to the war, I mean, it's not likely to result in a lasting conclusion, is it?
The devil's in the details on this, and I think both parties have to come to the table and negotiate what the line of effective control will be, and how that geography, the territory, is actually settled will determine if it actually will be a lasting peace. And neither side's going to get exactly what they want, but both sides have to be in a position that if the other one were to reinstigate hostilities, the cost or the consequences of that on the battlefield, not talking economics, talking about the military reinitiation of hostilities, would be so high that both sides would not dare do it.
Just before we crossed to you, we heard a clip of the US Vice President J.D. Vance speaking to Sean Hannity on Fox News. And one of the other things he said, apart from the clip we aired, was, quote, the Russians are going to have to give up stuff. The Ukrainians are going to give up stuff. But, you know, you could argue, looking at it from the outside, Ukraine has already given up quite a lot of, quote, stuff. And that's been given up on its behalf by the US president, who said, you know, they'll never join NATO, the 20% land of their territory that is occupied by Russia will not be returned to Ukraine. So that's been put out there. I mean, what's Russia giving up in all of this?
And again, this is the devil in the details, and we have to start from a realistic position here. Can Ukraine, short of direct involvement of European countries, the United States, to help fight in the conflict, short of that, does Ukraine have the capacity to eject the Russians out forcefully from Crimea and the 5 oblasts that President Putin annexed? Now, 2 of those 5 oblasts were never part of the Russian Republic going back to Khrushchev's time. So there is a historical precedent for a negotiated where this line of control will be. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the world has to accept Russia's annexation, whatever comes out of the negotiated solution. Again, going back to the end of World War II, no one in the West acknowledged the annexation or the occupation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. So again, you can have a peace, but you don't have to acknowledge where that line is necessarily.
Now, we've heard from the Trump administration that if Ukraine's leadership demonstrates a good faith commitment to peace, perhaps this idea of pulling all aid will be reconsidered. We're just hearing, in fact, the Ukrainian president has said, quote, last Friday's meeting with Donald Trump was regrettable and it, quote, did not go the way it was supposed to go. I mean, that sounds like an apology, regret. Is that likely to have the desired effect? Is that likely to bring about a reconsidering of this opinion by the US President Donald Trump?
Politically, an apology has some weight, some value, but quite frankly, in the geostrategic realities and open combat, it has really little relevance. What matters is that Zelenskyy came to D.C. There was every expectation that a deal was going to get set that would put the United States and Ukraine on track for an alignment of interest in an enduring way that would include security assurances over time. Maybe not explicit in a treaty. That clearly was what Zelenskyy was hoping, but that was beyond political potentials in D.C. right now. But his behavior in the White House really set things back unnecessarily. But back in Kyiv now in the last day, we're seeing positive movement by their own parliament, signaling that they acknowledge Trump's interest in a fair peace treaty or peace negotiation is sincere. So we're starting to see some of the walking back on the Ukraine side to try to get to a position where they can continue getting the military support. The financial assistance is not as significant on the battlefield, of course, as munitions, like artillery rounds and air defense, as you had in your segment earlier. But again, the ball is in the Ukrainians' court to get back to the table and show that they're willing to enter into a deal that can get to a lasting peace with greater assurances for security for them into the future. And again, the movement by France and the UK in this regard with offering up peacekeepers into, or at least troops in Ukraine, this is the type of tangible things that can become real once the fighting stops.
I mean, everyone wants an end to this war, of course. And I mean, Russia, of course, invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, having already annexed Crimea a decade earlier. I mean, do you think there's a realization at the White House? Because, I mean, you'd have thought there would be some support for a country that had been invaded and that, had now lost, let's say, 20% of its territory. Or do you think that perhaps there's an opinion in the Trump administration that Russia was stoked by NATO and acted out of necessity and had no other choice but to invade Ukraine? I mean, what do you think is the thinking in the Trump administration?
My dealings here in Washington, D.C., with many of the folks that are in or adjacent to the administration, I don't pick that up. And my assessment is NATO expansion, quite to the contrary, has actually prevented the worst behavior by the Russians. Historically, we can go back and look at the record on that, interventions even from the Soviet times. So I don't subscribe to that, and I don't think most people do. And I think there is a wide acknowledgement that the Ukrainian people have fought very bravely and continue to. But with the lack of in the absence of any strategy and a complete misreading for how the Russians would respond, this is an over fear of escalation on the part of the Biden administration. We basically got ourselves into, or at least led the Ukrainians into, an unwinnable war of attrition with a much larger belligerent in Russia. So we have to find a way to get forward. And more of the same is not the solution. And I think that is what animates a lot of what you're seeing coming out of the Trump administration, is to try to change the dynamic, shift into a new framework. If we can't get to a strategic change of the strategic environment, that might call for more action and pressure on the Russians than we've seen to date. And there are indications going after the dark fleet, which is supplying Russia a lot of money on its oil, petroleum trades, as well as other leverages against the North Koreans and the Chinese, could also be in the offing, if not already being pursued.
Just lastly, I mean, to sort of wrap up this conversation, one quote I found quite interesting came from New York Republican Representative Mike Lawler, who said, quote, stopping support for Ukraine would jeopardize the stability of Europe and the free world. What are your thoughts on that, just to wrap up?
Well, one point is, nations have to take after their own security and defense, or they bear the consequences. Ukraine has learned this since 2014 to 2022. They had not been able to get the military capacity that would have deterred Russia. They now bear the consequences of that inability, whether they did not show bad priorities of their resources and their budgets over those years. But that's also a lesson that applies to NATO countries as well. If you cannot take care of your own defense, you're not a good ally or a good partner into NATO. And we're starting to see that turn because the lesson is made very explicit by what Putin unleashed in February of 2022.
All right, we can leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Captain Brent Sadler, former US military diplomat. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, for more, we can speak now to Alina Frolova, former Deputy Minister of Defense there in Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Obviously getting reaction to this announcement out of Washington today. Do you view this as having been a betrayal?
Good afternoon, first of all, and thank you for inviting me. Well, of course we do, yes, because we've been at least relying that United States will continue to stay our partner, a difficult partner with some kind of change in situation. But frankly saying, many experts, and I'm absolutely sure that officials here also been considering this so-called Plan B or the worst case scenario. We are not there yet, not in worst case. It's not like a 100% stop of all the assistance. It's we need to go deeper and to understand that it doesn't seem like a cutting of all the 100 supplies now. But anyway, we are moving forward toward that scenario. And of course, no one is happy with that. But what I should do, what I should tell you that within the last years, we can be hardly impressed with something. So that's some kind of working mood here.
We've heard from the head of Ukraine's Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, Alexander Merechko, who says that President Trump is pushing us towards capitulation. Is that the way it looks there in Kyiv?
Yeah, absolutely, because we see the efforts which American administration, Trump administration is putting into the facilitating the peace deal with Putin, with Russia. And we see that obviously they are ready to give them a lot to Russians in promises like releasing of sanctions, territorial, territories of Ukraine and some other points which are under discussion. We don't see the peace through threat in that situation with Russia, but we see this approach with Ukraine. And obviously, it seems like they choose and they think the weakest part and try to oppress it to reach some kind of a deal. But the issue is that we are not the weakest part, and I'm sorry that the Trump administration didn't recognize it till this moment.
But we have heard Washington say that this decision to halt aid would be reversed if President Zelenskyy demonstrates, quote, good faith towards peace talks. I mean, what does Ukraine think Washington wants it to do?
It's difficult to say for sure, yes, but I think that they want some kind of excuses, which we can discuss with you whether they should be or not. And Ukraine is fully supporting its president with all the statements which he did. And so they want excuses, they want some deals to demonstrate that Trump is on victory position. And I think that they want us to fit into requirements of Russians so that do not make some kind of opposition and sign the papers and here it is, deal on the table. But we're not speaking about a 1 month period for Ukraine. We're speaking about long-term projections. We've been in this situation already in 2016, 17, 18, 19. We came to 2022, and we do understand that any deal can be sustainable without long-term guarantees and sufficient support of Ukrainian army and economy. So for us, it has no sense. That's why I don't think that it would be some kind of successful pressure and negotiations in the nearest future before the positions, including the Trump administration, won't be changed.
I mean, we all saw what happened in the Oval Office on Friday, and I know people around the world were extremely shocked by the scene. Is there any feeling at all there in Ukraine that perhaps President Zelenskyy could have and should have played his cards differently? Is anyone blaming him?
Every clever person considers that you always can do better. I mean, that's normal consideration for every person who has some brains and who is targeted at development. And so, of course, we discussing here what could be done better. But it doesn't mean that the whole situation, the whole picture, approach, tonality, acquisitions, and many other things, they demonstrating that we don't think that something in behavior of Zelenskyy could provoke such a reaction. And organization actually of this meeting before the negotiations to speak to media, American media, and if you saw, pay attention that DJ Vance, when he started to shout at the president, he was looking not at Zelenskyy but at media. All that demonstrates that the task of this part was more addressing the American audience and demonstrating something to them than trying to negotiate any positions with Zelenskyy and with Ukraine.
So how long can Ukraine last for without US support? What is the state of the hardware, the military hardware stocks there?
I don't know, because I'm not in capacity and I don't have access to some kind of official data. However, today the relevant committee on security and defense said that those critical weapons, or some equipment which we receive from United States, we have some stocks for half a year. But we should understand that even in case that we have a lack of that critical weapons, pieces from United States, it doesn't mean that we don't have weapons and we don't have ability to fight. We will probably lose in quality on some, for example, air defense or intelligence or something like that. But first of all, we still have time to solve the issue, at least partially, to compensate it with some other capabilities which can be compensated to a decreased dependence from United States. But of course, there are some pieces which make the critical dependency, like Patriots, for example. So the situation is yet not clear. However, it's quite dangerous from the point of view of additional losses we can bear.
And in terms of the actual amount of money the United States has spent on supporting Ukraine, I mean, some in the Trump administration are using numbers like 500 billion US dollars. I'm only seeing 175 billion as the total figure for total US assistance to Ukraine. What is the right figure in your opinion?
Well, 500, this is something from the Russian TV, because they include there also potential losses of the American companies, which were paralyzed in Russia and lost their incomes in Russia. And this is what was promoted before by Russian propaganda. And it means that Trump administration is actively watching Russian TV and relying on their figures. Even 175 is the questioned figure, because not all the supplies are done. Not all the equipment was a modern equipment, so we can speak about the coefficients. But anyway, we cannot look back, because it was granted, a granted equipment, and we cannot say that it was something we need to pay back. But at the same time, even the figure 175 is some kind of questioned. And if we will compare with EU gave at least the similar amount, even more. And if you was looking at the latest events, for example, Danish government said that they will provide us 11-something billion for this year, which means half of those money which usually United States is given. So we're not speaking about something very crucial for United States in situation when they are interested in ending up this war without personal involvement and troops on the ground.
Okay, so in terms of getting that money back, the United States suddenly says it wants that money back, and the Vice President, J.D. Vance, on Fox News has called on President Zelenskyy to accept this minerals deal. How do you feel, and how do ordinary Ukrainians feel about that deal?
It's obviously a blackmail, and in very we don't know even how to call this manner. However, the type of the documents which was prepared and published before these negotiations in White House was quite different from the initial agreement, and actually it was a memorandum without legal obligations to do something. So that paper, as we understood, was already developed to save the face of Trump administration, to demonstrate that they saved that they signed some kind of a deal. But what was said there in that document, we saw just intention to establish the fund, and all the relevant details about that fund should be considered later when the fund to be established. So it was like a pre-deal agreement, but I think that the Trump administration wanted to demonstrate something signed and prove their abilities in front of the American publics more than this agreement brings something to the United States or to Ukraine.
Yeah, that was said on Fox News last night. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is why President Trump, you think, is so angry by something that President Zelenskyy said, which he said that the end of the war with Russia is still a long way off. I mean, Donald Trump got onto social media commenting on that, saying it was absolutely the wrong kind of comment. Why do you think that's annoyed him so much?
Well, because he tries to promote his ability to end up this war in a week or 2 or months in quite a short period. And of course, it doesn't fit into reality, but he considers that I believe that, I don't know for sure, but I think that he can consider that the words of Zelenskyy are some kind of contradicting to what he said. However, if you will look at the whole speech of the President Zelenskyy, there were no any contradiction with that statement, and he was describing the process of how the negotiations are going on. And I think that some kind of personal factors also played the role, that Trump from the first period of him being a president had some kind of attempt to oppress the Zelenskyy and to press on the some kind of deals which he was interested in that time, and he failed. So I think that both that factors in combination, they make such a painful reaction of him at these words.
I mean, do you think President Zelensky's position is tenable? Do you think he should perhaps offer his resignation to try to save the relationship between his country and the United States? And were he to do that, is there someone lined up who could replace him quickly?
We're a country in war, and sorry, this is Ukrainian decision which president we would like to have. In any situation, the good leadership is one of the factors to win this war. So we are not ready to exchange the presidents just because DJ Vance or someone else from senators want us to do, because this is our destiny. And unfortunately, in this situation, we are not in position to trust America with their assistance, with their influence, with their ability to end up this war. That is why we are not discussing the rating of President Zelenskyy, and level of trust to him is quite high, and level of support to him after his Washington visit increased, including the support among the armed forces. So we have no reasons to replace him, and this is directly prohibited by our constitution. And we are not in position to question our constitution, because we appear like a civilized people who live in the state which supports the constitution and rule of law.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, the United States president and his vice president in the Oval Office, they don't seem to think that President Zelenskyy is sufficiently grateful for Washington's support. They think he's disrespectful. They leveled all sorts of accusations at him. What is your message to Washington?
All Ukrainian nation is very grateful to American nation for all the support we got. We do understand and do appreciate it. And many times in personal communications, in public communications, all the nation of Ukraine, all those people who are refugees in the United States, our politicians, they were bringing thank you to American people, to administrations, and we said it like millions of times. I don't think that there is like a truth in those words, and I think that this is just a manipulation. And I don't know what kind of appreciation the Trump administration want, but we speak all the time, and this is really truth, that we do understand the role of American nation, which it played in all the events before, and our possibility to stay alive till that moment, and we will not forget it.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Alina Frolova, former Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine. Thanks again. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Stefanie Babst, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The US, of course, saying it's going to cut off military aid to Ukraine. The US role up until this point has included weaponry, air defense systems, intelligence sharing. I mean, how long can Ukraine realistically last without all of that?
This is a question that Ukrainians can answer because they do the operational military planning and they know firsthand what type of capabilities they require tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and in the weeks to come. I guess they share that with European allies. So it's not really very easy to say they can only hold on so and so long. But I think what really has driven Ukrainian resilience ever since the full-fledged assault on Ukraine began was their resilience and their ability to adapt to military requirements. So I must admit, I'm fairly confident that they can, hold the fortress and continue to defend themselves for some time to come.
Is there any way in which Ukraine can make up for the shortfall?
Well, obviously, the Europeans are now in the role of supporting Ukraine. They must really deliver. My criticism has always been in the past 3 years that they delivered too little, too late, and with too many national caveats and restrictions. This is a policy they really need to leave now behind and come in fully, and deliver everything that the Ukrainians require. And it's my understanding from looking at the political discussions in Europe that it is not only now about Europeans trying to generate more money and really talk about these immense financial sums they would like to come up with. They are also ready in order to not let Ukraine be crushed under the bus by President Trump and Mr. Putin jointly.
Now, this decision by President Trump was made without consulting NATO allies. And we've heard in the last couple of days someone very close to Donald Trump, Elon Musk, who says that the United States should leave NATO. I don't know what you think about that. What would that mean for NATO?
Well, I mean, it is not Elon Musk, first of all, who should come up with any kind of judgment on this, because he is clearly absolutely illiterate in these type of issues. But we've heard President Trump already making similar noises during his election campaign. So I maintained the view over the past half year or so that the allies would be well advised to really prepare, do contingency planning, because even if Mr. Trump will not officially abandon NATO, he has a wide range of opportunities to really do harm to NATO. And he has already harmed NATO massively. Primarily, obviously, by leaving the consensus on Russia. And if I think back of just 2 days or 3 days ago, when the U.S. Defense Secretary ordered the U.S. Cyber Command to stand off all operations, defensive and offensive cyber operations against Russia, this is something really, really bad. I mean, this is almost insane, I think, if you, and unless you side with Putin. So this harms the alliance. So I think politically speaking, the European allies should really stop trying to cling on to President Trump, try to influence his course of action, because clearly he has already made up his mind and he is implementing his strategy of realigning with the worst enemy Europe has had in the past couple of, decades, which is Russia. So I think we need to be realistic. Transatlantic relationship is is unraveling in front of our eyes, and we need to prepare for the unthinkable and try to prevent chaos and disruption. So if the United States were to say, we will no longer prepared to stick to Article 5, then they should bloody hell say so. And then the Europeans have a chance to hopefully orderly prepare for a withdrawal of NATO. But this disruptive type of daily spontaneous statements by the White House is really not only annoying, it's is really very disruptive. And so it pushes the Europeans always back into the reactive corner of which they really need to get out.
Sure, and we saw some pretty major disruption on Friday in the Oval Office, which President Trump said will make for great television. And certainly, we're all talking about it. What went through your head, just out of interest, as you saw those events unfold?
Both President Trump and also his Vice President Zelenskyy and the entire MAGA gang, and Vance, and the entire MAGA gang behind, they have never been very sympathetic to President Zelenskyy. Never. I mean, this is something which you could see, for months unfolding. He is somebody complete opposite to them. He is somebody who has principles. He is somebody who fights for the rules-based order. He is somebody who has courage, who has balls, and these are all characteristics they lack. So yes, he is clearly in their way, and one way of coming closer to a deal with Russia is to also put pressure on Zelenskyy, because the Russian government has tried all along in order to oust Zelenskyy. So this is another, I'd say, part of the overall puzzle and strategy of the Trump administration to really realign with Russia and to, as I said, to really have put Ukrainians under a bus.
Yeah, there's one piece of interesting analysis that we've heard in the last 24 hours coming from the historian and senior lecturer in modern European and international history at the University of Sydney. His name is Marco Giranti, and he said that meeting gave cover to the Trump administration to suspend the aid, which has now happened. And he raised the question of whether that Oval Office clash was really entirely improvised. He then went on to say that this latest announcement was a massive gift to Russia. Here's what he said.
I think it's absolutely a win for Putin. This is something that Putin could only have dreamed of, even just a week or a month ago. We've seen events hurl forward at a shocking speed, and Putin has so far gotten everything he could have wanted. He outlined last year his war aims and the conditions under which he would start negotiations for peace, and Trump has given him almost everything he wanted right away. So I think this is a major win for Putin.
Okay, so he seemed to be suggesting that everything that's happened so far has gone the way of the Russian president. Have there been any concessions up until this point made by the Russians? And do you agree with what you just heard?
I do agree with one exception, which is that the Russian side has absolutely no interest and no incentive to move forward on what we keep on discussing under the label peace. President Putin certainly is looking forward for international recognition, for the lifting of sanctions, for a bilateral meeting with Trump. So there are lots of interesting things that he can book as potential gains back home, but he's certainly not interested in altering his overall strategic objectives of changing the balance of power in Europe by force, of destroying Ukraine, of destabilizing Europeans, and of ultimately also ending NATO. And if you look at his performance so far, I think he has made really a lot of progress. And the biggest progress that he has made is due to President Trump. So yes, we are really in the eye here of a geopolitical storm with the Ukrainians right in the midst. But I think, looking more broadly at the ramifications of what's ongoing, that I wonder what countries in the Middle East, in your region, or in other parts of the world, in Asia, long-standing U.S. allies, say when they look at an U.S. administration, which is clearly so unreliable and which is clearly ready to give up long-standing partnerships, turn around and actually betray allies. I think this is a very worrisome development, and this is not just something that Europe needs to struggle with. I think we would need to really build a much broader coalition of democratic Ukraine supporters, including countries from the Middle East, including countries from Asia, such as South Korea or Japan, because at the end of the day, we are all sitting in the same boat if we want to hold the fortress and continue defending the rules-based order.
Okay, and I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, we do hear and we do speak to a lot of people in the Trump administration here at Al Arabiya News, and one thing we often hear them saying is, "This is Europe's problem. Why should we have to pay for it? Let's get this war over and done with." How do you answer those sorts of argument from Washington?
Well, for starters, Ukraine is not Afghanistan. I mean, the Trump administration, number one, messed it up big time in Afghanistan, with the exception that they didn't even bother to talk about peace in Afghanistan. They just turned around, made a really bad deal without the Europeans with the Taliban, and handed over the country to those people who actually attacked the United States on 9/11. So I think they would like to repeat that type of template in variations, obviously, because the broader objective for the Trump people is a realignment with Russia. And if they really want to realign with a war criminal and an aggressive nuclear blackmailer, I mean, then they should go for it. But my point remains the same. We, the group of democratic countries who have an interest to not live in a jungle where the right of the might basically takes place and reigns, we need to push back, and we need to push back hard on both fronts, both vis-à-vis Washington as well as Moscow.
Okay, Stefanie Babst, we're going to have to leave it there. Former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, in other world news, a possible trade war erupted today as the US President Donald Trump's new 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada took effect, alongside a hike in Chinese duties from 10% to 20%. Well, the move has thrown the US into a trade clash with its top three partners, rattling global markets and sparking possible costly retaliation from Washington's North American allies. Well, President Trump did warn yesterday that the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico would come into effect today, and he also made it clear that reciprocal tariffs would begin on the 2nd of April, adding that there was no way for Mexico or Canada to avoid the tariffs that he'd promised to impose.
The tariffs, as you know, will start a week earlier than the reciprocal, which is going to be on a couple of weeks earlier. Reciprocal tariffs start on April 2nd. And I wanted to make it April 1st, but I didn't want to go April Fool's Day, because that costs a lot of money, but that one day. But so we're going April 2nd. So what they have to do is build their car plants, frankly, and other things in the United States. No room left for Mexico or for Canada. No, the tariffs, they're all set.
President Trump speaking there. Well, Beijing has retaliated with tariffs of up to 15% on a broad range of US farm exports like soybeans, beef, fruit and vegetables. It's also added some 24 more US companies to its list of those facing export controls and other restrictions. Meanwhile, Canada announced it would impose tariffs on more than $100 billion worth of American goods over the next 21 days.
Let's be clear. If Trump is imposing tariffs, we're ready. We are ready with $155 billion worth of tariffs, and we're ready with the first tranche of tariffs, which is $30 billion.
Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Ambassador John Veroneau, who is the former Deputy US Trade Representative and former US Assistant Secretary of Defense, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. President Trump said last month that these tariffs are a big deal and the beginning of making America rich again. In your view, are these tariffs the right way to go?
No, they're not. The president sees tariffs as serving multiple purposes, partly revenue, partly leverage, but mostly, frankly, for protection. So there have been some who thought these tariff threats were mere threats to address other problems, but it's clear from the first Trump administration and this most recent actions this week that the president views tariffs as a positive tool for reindustrializing America. I think they will turn out not to be a good tool for that purpose, but he is the president, and these are his views.
Sure. I mean, have we ever seen anything on this scale before? Can you remember a time when tariffs like this were ever imposed on trade partners?
Well, certainly not in my lifetime. You know, you'd have to go back to, frankly, the 1930s when tariffs were seen by, many countries as tools to protect their domestic industries. But the Great Depression and trade retaliations and trade wars, I think, proved that those were not useful tools, and that trade on balance is a win-win for countries and companies and certainly consumers. And viewing trade as a zero-sum game is just inaccurate. But unfortunately, it's the mindset of President Trump with regard to many things, including trade deficits and tariffs.
What's this all about? I mean, what are these tariffs aiming to achieve? And we've had so many messages, some messages suggesting it's about fentanyl, others saying it's about an unequal trade balance, others suggesting it's about immigration. What's your take?
Well, I think unlawful immigration and fentanyl crossing the border, are issues the president has been concerned about, and I think do warrant some addressing. I don't agree that tariffs are the way to address those problems, but I think the use of those issues to justify under the statute these new tariffs is merely just a reflection of the president's desire to have these tariffs. And it seems as though there was very little Canada could have done to address those two issues, since, frankly, the Canadian border is really not a factor in those issues. So I think those issues were raised up merely to justify under the statute that he is using for these tariffs. But I think it's more just a reflection of, as I said, the president just believes tariffs are a good thing and sees them as a way to reindustrialize the U.S. economy, notwithstanding the fact that most 80% plus of industrial jobs that have been lost over the past 40 years in America and in other countries have been due to labor-saving technologies. A modern factory just requires a lot fewer people working in them. And that is not going to change because of tariffs.
So we've got a situation where we've got 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico, 10% plus another 10% against China. Now, those countries are almost certainly going to retaliate if they haven't already. Beijing's announced some countermeasures of its own, targeting American agriculture and food products. How hard can those countries hit back, and what might that do to the U.S. economy?
Well, they as you know, they have announced and certainly will retaliate. I think if for no other reason than, national pride, frankly. So, the U.S. Is the world's largest market economy. So, losing access or having access to the U.S. market impaired through tariffs is a big economic hit to those countries. But it will be a hit for U.S. consumers as well, and farmers, and you're going to start to see that emerge over the next few weeks. So those other countries don't, certainly Canada doesn't have the leverage that the U.S. has. It's a much smaller market, but they will take actions that will hurt U.S. consumers. And overall, I suspect we will see inflation reemerge, which is ironic since so much of our election was about inflation and President Trump's commitment to address inflation. Certainly these tariffs are not going to help in that effort.
Now, back in November when we last spoke, I asked you if we were on the verge of a full-blown trade war, and you suggested it was perhaps a bit too early to tell. 3 or 4 months later, what's your current assessment?
Well, I would say we're much closer to such a scenario now. As I said back in November, there was still, some question in some people's minds whether these tariff threats with regard to Canada and Mexico and other threats, frankly, are mere leverage tools for negotiating better terms of trade. But I don't think I think enough time has passed and actions have been taken by the president that suggest that these aren't just threats. The president believes that tariffs are good for America. He announced also this week plans to impose tariffs on agricultural products in April and suggests that that's good for American farmers. And we'll see if they agree. I suspect they won't, because they will be retaliated against, as we saw in the first Trump administration, where effectively the U.S. soybean market to China was lost. And I suspect we're going to see further examples of that, not to mention the negative impact on U.S. consumers. And there's a lot more people who eat food than grow food.
Sure, so there's going to be quite a bit of pain, it would appear, in many different places as a result of these decisions. But could there be another outcome, which is more dialogue and perhaps a solution? I mean, is that a long way off, do you think?
It could be. It depends. If a more surgical approach is taken. The U.S. and India have announced plans to begin negotiating, some type of a trade agreement. India is one of those countries that has, relatively high tariffs. So I think that addressing that and using access to the U.S. market by India, I think is good leverage and necessary leverage to address some of those high barriers that India has relative to U.S. barriers for Indian products. So as a surgical matter, I think, these threats and use of tariffs can be a good thing. But right now they seem to be using it in a very blunt way that I think it's difficult to see how, A, what the goal is, and B, how blunt use of tariffs will achieve whatever goal may emerge and clarify.
Just as an extension of that point, I mean, are there ever any winners in a trade war? And I'm thinking about perhaps countries that are slightly on the periphery of the trade war that aren't directly affected. Do they tend to benefit?
Well, I would say, trade wars, in the end, don't benefit anyone. They are, they do a lot of disruption to supply chains, et cetera. And consumers and producers' arrangements are in place for a reason, because they make economic sense. And to the extent that governments step in through tariffs or other measures to disrupt those relationships, then almost by definition that is suboptimal. So I don't think this will be good long term. We'll see what the future brings, but I really don't think this is going to end well if we're going to continue to see an escalation of tariffs. Now we have tariffs now on Chinese products, many of them, close to 50%. We have tariffs on our, closest allies and neighbors now of 25%. So I don't see this going well, but I think eventually the folly of these massive tariffs will reveal themselves, and there'll be a course correction. That is my hope, at least.
And just lastly, Ambassador Veroneau, just to sort of wrap up this conversation, Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway fame has said, quote, "Tariffs are an act of war." He's talked about their inflationary impact, suggesting that consumers face higher prices as a result. He says the tooth fairy doesn't pay for those price increases. Just tell us, what does all of this mean for consumers generally?
Well, it means once again that Warren Buffett is a wealthy man for a reason. He's very smart, and he's correct that these tariffs are paid by someone in a very narrow sense on a particular product, depending on the particular market and leverage between buyer and seller. They can be, borne. The burdens of those tariffs can be borne more by the selling country than the buying country, but for the most part, ultimately, they're borne by U.S. consumers. These tariffs will be, and that will, I think, reveal itself in time. And I suspect there will be some kind of course correction, or at least certainly that is my hope.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Ambassador John Veroneau. Thanks again.
Great, thank you.
Well, for a Canadian perspective, we can speak now to Professor Moshe, an economics expert at Concordia University in Montreal. Professor, great to have you with us. These tariffs weren't a massive surprise, were they? Is Canada ready for them?
Well, Canada says it is. I'm not sure that they actually are. It's been 30 years that we've had a free trade agreement with the U.S. and with Mexico, and our free trade agreement with the U.S. goes back even further still. Tariffs have only been used as retaliatory measures for violating the agreement, but not as a blanket way that nobody has done anything wrong and let's just hit them where it hurts. So we'll find announcements coming later today from the Canadian government as to what they plan to do to retaliate. But I have a feeling that two wrongs are not going to make a right here. This is just going to make a messy situation messier.
Okay, I was going to ask you about the impact. I mean, what is the impact going to be, the immediate impact of these tariffs on the Canadian economy?
So for the Canadian economy, anything that has a short shelf life, like fruits and vegetables, we're probably going to see jumps in prices right away because they're going to be subject to tariffs. Anything that has a very integrated supply chain, which is very common with the U.S., like in our auto sector, a car can pass back and forth across the border multiple times. Every one of those times it passes back and forth, it's going to be subject to the tariff and the counter tariff. You could easily see that production starts shutting down on manufactured goods. And that means then that people are going to be laid off, and whether they're laid off temporarily or fired permanently, and whether businesses decide that they're going to just shut up operations and move towards the U.S. These are going to be decisions that start coming in quick order based on how much inventory they have and how long they can withstand the tariffs when they're in place.
We've heard from the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saying, quote, tariffs will disrupt what's been an incredibly successful trading relationship. In terms of retaliation, what can we expect?
Not much. I think that it's more political than it is economics driven. The amount of goods and services that we import from the U.S. is around $500 billion a year, but the U.S. economy is around $30 trillion a year. So even if we stopped every single import from the U.S. to teach them a lesson, we're talking about $1.50 out of every $100 worth of economic activity. If you had $100 in your pocket and $1.50 went missing, you might be upset for a little bit, but you still have the $100. I don't know how much sleep you're going to lose. I don't know how much you're going to rethink your life's philosophy and your outlook. I don't know that we're going to be able to hit the U.S. in any meaningful way that's going to make them reconsider what they've done to their closest trading partner and their biggest ally.
Yes, but if you acted collectively with the other countries that have been affected, and there's quite a lot of them, I mean, that would have quite a serious retaliatory effect, wouldn't it?
It could, but of course, the last 80 years of more liberalized trade has been that the U.S. has been essentially the global police officer that's dangled in front of any recalcitrant countries. If you're willing to open up to trade, we can offer you access to one of the biggest and richest markets in the world. If they're now pulling up the drawbridge saying, thanks, we don't want to do this, and we're seeing this across a whole bunch of other policies where they're just kind of looking inward, then does that incentivize everybody else to say, all right, well, if they're going to do it, we're going to do it too. So there is the potential here that, yes, we could group together and try and take aim at the U.S., but I don't know that even there's the desire to do it if all it's going to do is escalate problems for each of those individual countries. How strong that coalition is going to be is probably in doubt.
We've heard from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce CEO Candice Lang saying that, quote, today's reckless decision by the U.S. administration is forcing Canada and the United States towards recessions. So she seems to think it's both countries will be forced into recessions, job losses, and in short, she said, economic disaster. What's the sort of general public reaction to this news there in Canada?
In Canada, I don't think we've ever seen such unity among Canadians, whether it's wanting to boycott U.S. goods, acts of patriotism. Hockey over here is, of course, our big sport, and we had a recent competition with the Americans where we've taken to booing their national anthem. And when the Canadian team won, it was a level of pride that we haven't seen in the country in a long time. Even the separatist province of Quebec is now feeling a very tight part of Canada right now. So how long that lasts is going to be determined, I guess, by how resilient our economy is. But the CEO was correct there that if the country tips into recession, is it going to be that every region starts to try and defend its own interests rather than hold together as Team Canada? And of course, in Canada, our politics are a little messy right now. Prime Minister that you mentioned is going to be stepping down in the next couple of weeks, and the person that replaces him is probably going to call an election about 6 weeks after that. So we could have an entirely new government by the summer, and how they're going to relate to the U.S. administration is still a little bit in doubt as well.
Okay, so what about the idea of becoming the 51st state of the United States? Is that the way people are seeing things heading?
There's no chance of that happening. So beyond the fact that it's just a ridiculous notion coming out of the president's mouth, he's not even considering what would be involved in doing it. Short of an actual military invasion, each of the 10 provinces in Canada and our 3 territories would have to vote to essentially dissolve the Canadian Confederation. And then the U.S. would have to vote to accept Canada as its 51st state. Puerto Rico has been hanging on for decades with the idea of statehood dangling there, and yet there seems to be no impetus to make that happen. I don't know that the Americans would even want Canada, because Canada tends to lean a little left of center, which means that our natural inclination would be to vote Democrat, and that would probably compromise a lot of the administration's power that they've accumulated in the House and the Senate, in the judiciary, and even in the White House, if all of a sudden they have 40 million people who are probably inclined not to vote for the current administration.
Okay, so we've covered lots of different scenarios. Let's perhaps end with the most likely of all the scenarios, that Canada does something to rectify this situation and to address the United States' concerns and has those tariffs done away with. What's Canada supposed to do? What's Canada likely to do?
So I think what's going to happen is that in 2026, there was supposed to be a revisiting of the free trade agreement that exists in North America. I think the likeliest outcome here is that we're going to address the president's initial concerns, which was fentanyl and immigrants crossing the northern border. He might want us to increase our defense spending a little bit more to meet NATO requirements of 2% of GDP, maybe a little bit of opening up the Canadian market to American farmers, to American banks, to American telecoms. And then it's going to be to advance that revisiting from 2026 into the middle to late 2025. And at that point, then everything's on the table for whether we continue with the agreement or whether we start creating carve-outs for various industries. I think that's what the president has wanted all along. It's the only thing that he's been consistent on for 40 years in the public eye is a distaste for trade. So let's put that on the table then and see what exactly he wants. And then Canada has to decide how important is that relationship with the U.S., even if it's in a reduced form as opposed to no form.
Okay, well, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Professor Moshe at Concordia University of Montreal. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.